Hello, this is Andrew Perkins, and in this video I'm going to walk you through using jQuery to add some Ajax to your Cakephp applications. We'll be building a contact form. We'll first use the built-in Cakephp Js helper to do the Ajax database submission, but then we'll also write some custom jQuery to do some Ajax validation using our Cakephp model validations. So this should give you a good idea of how to implement Ajax into your Cake apps using both the built-in JS helper and dropping down and writing your own jQuery to get it working with Cakephp. So how the application will work is a user can come to our contact form here and send us a message. The message will be validated, and if it validates, it'll be stored into the database. All of this will be using Ajax. We won't actually be sending any emails, as the point of this tutorial is how to do Ajax validation and Ajax DB submissions in Cakephp. So first I want to go over what I already created here and what I'm working with. It's a very basic installation of Cakephp. I've created a form, and we can take the user's name, email, and message, and it validates that information. This is not using any Ajax yet, and if it all validates, it'll save it to the database. So let's take a look at the code real quick. Here's my Cakephp application in my text editor. Under the app folder, I'll just start at the top. I have a messages controller, and it has an index action, and it's just going to handle the form submission. This is pretty standard. It checks if the form is empty, it checks if this save was successful, and if it was, it sets a flash message and redirects the user. Inside the models folder, I have a message model, and this just does some basic validation for the name, email, and message fields. I'm ensuring that the name and the message fields are not empty, and for the email, I'm ensuring that it's a valid email using the email and not empty rules that Cakephp gives you. Inside of the views folder, I have a messages folder to hold our messages controller's views, and I have one view, index.ctp, that's for the index action, and this just creates a form. If you notice, I'm doing the create method for the form helper a little different. You don't actually have to pass in the model and then the array as a second parameter and telling it what action to submit to. You can leave it blank, and Cakephp will by default submit to its own action, to itself. So it'll submit, since this is the index view for our messages controller's index action, by default, if I leave it empty, it's going to submit to the index action. A few other things to note here that you'll want to make sure you do is I've created an ID for each of these fields. So I have a field for name, email, and message, and the ID for each one is exactly the same as the name for that field, and it also matches the field name in the database. And that's important because when we do our Ajax validation, we will be passing in the name of the field. That way we can dynamically check whether or not the field is valid or not. So you need to make sure that your ID is the same as the name of your field. And finally, I have a submit button, and I close the form. So let's take a look at our table real quick in our database. Let's go to the structure. And here you can see I have an ID field. It's an int type, it's auto increments, and it's a primary key. I also have a name and email field. Both of those are of varchar type. And finally, I have the message field, which is of a text type. And notice that these name, email, and message, like I said, they're the same as the ID name, email, and message, and that is important that your IDs match up, because again, we'll be using that to dynamically check when we pass it in through using jQuery's Ajax method called post. We'll be using the post method to do the Ajax validation. It needs to match up with the name of the table so that we can dynamically check whether or not it validates. So there's the basic structure of our application. It's really simple, just as a simple database submission currently, and we're going to add some Ajax to it. The first thing we're going to do is actually get the submission to do, we're going to submit using Ajax, and we're going to use Cakephp's helper, the JS helper, to do that submission. The JS helper by default uses the jQuery framework or library, so we need to go get that. We can go to jQuery.com and download it. We can select all of this and copy it. And after you copy it, we need to create a new file. We'll go to our text editor, under app, under webroot, and in the JS folder, we'll create a new JavaScript file. I'm going to call it jQuery.js, and I'm going to paste in the jQuery library code that I just copied. Save it and close it out. So now we need to tell our application to actually use the jQuery file. Since we don't need jQuery on all of our pages, we only need it on our index page. Right here at the top, we can use the HTML helper and its script method, and we can tell it to include a JavaScript file for us. So we're going to say include jQuery. Now by default, if you leave it like this, when you look at your source code, it's actually going to create the link tag and link to your JavaScript, and it's going to be right there in the body of your HTML. And we don't want that. We want it to be in the head of our HTML like you normally do, where you stick your CSS files and everything. So you can pass a second parameter to the script method and tell it false, and that will make it use the script for layout variable that's inside of your layout. So we'll take a look at the layout real quick. Under app, under views, layouts, I have default.ctp, and this is a standard Cakephp layout. I copied it right from the Cakephp library. You can get a copy of this just by going to your Cake folder, under libs, under view, under layouts, and you'll see default.ctp. You can just copy all of this. The only difference is that I removed the documentation at the top, and I also got rid of the call to the SQL element dump here. So I just copied all of that and created my own default layout here, and I'm using that code. And as you can see, Cake uses scripts for layout. So in your view files, if you want to only load this jQuery file for this page, you can call the HTML helper method, HTML helper's script method, tell it to load jQuery and pass in false as the second parameter, and it'll load it in this spot of your document where scripts for layout is. So it'll load it up here in the head for you. So we can close the layout. And so we have jQuery loaded. Let's check and make sure it works. We can go back to our browser, and I'll refresh this page. And if we look at the source code, we can see that it did not insert it in the body, but if we scroll over up here in the head, we can see that it included the script tag for our jQuery file right here in the head, just like we wanted. Alright. Now we need to enable a helper and a component that we're going to be using to add some Ajax to our application. So at the top of our messages controller, I'm going to create a new variable here called helpers. This is to load in any helpers that I want to use, and I'm going to be using the JS helper. The JS helper is like a combination of the now deprecated Ajax and JavaScript helpers. It'll give you Ajax and JavaScript functionality. You don't have to write any JavaScript with it. You can just write PHP, and it generates the JavaScript for you. We're also going to be using a component, so I will create a components variable here to load in the component that I would like to use. We're going to be using the request handler component. The request handler component has a really cool method called isAjax, and it returns a true or false value of whether or not the current request is an Ajax request or not, and we'll be using that later. There we go. So once you have the JS helper and the request handler loaded in, the next thing we need to do is tell Cakephp where any JavaScript that's generated by our JS helper should be loaded, or where it should be displayed. Inside of one of our views, when we use the JS helper, it's going to generate some JavaScript for us. So we need to tell the application where that should be displayed, whether it should be in line, whether it should be displayed right where we put it in the view, or whether it should be cached and put inside of a JS file so that it's unobtrusive. We're going to choose the last one. So what I'm going to do is open up our layout file again. I'm going to close the cake folder, open up app, views, layouts, and open up default.ctp one more time. And here in the layout, after the scripts for layout call, we're going to use the JS helper, and we're going to use its write buffer method. So we're going to echo out this, and then the JS helper, and we're going to use its write buffer method. The write buffer method is telling the JS helper where it should put any JavaScript that it generates. In this case, we're saying to display it in the head right after any of the scripts that are called from our views. So in our index view, it's going to load the jQuery file first, and then when we use the JS helper, it's going to be called right after it. And by default, it's going to write our JavaScript inline right into our HTML. But we'd like it to be cached and held in a separate file so that it's unobtrusive and it's not just sitting in our HTML. To do that, all you have to do is pass in an array of options to the write buffer method and set cache equal to true. We can save it. We won't actually be able to see that that's working right now, but we will in a moment after we start using the JS helper. So now we're ready to get started actually doing some Ajax. So I'm going to go back to our index view, and we're going to do an Ajax submission using the JS helper. To do so, it's really simple. The form helper has this submit button method to create a submit button, but the JS helper also has a submit button, but rather than just being a regular form element, it also does an Ajax submission. So we're going to change this to be the JS helper's submit button. It takes the same parameters as the regular form helper method does. The first one is a string of what you want the text on the button to be. The second one is an array of options. The difference is that this array of options for the JS submit method also has some Ajax options that the form submit method does not. So we're going to be setting these Ajax options. There's 3 of them that we're interested in. The first one is called before, and this is what you want to happen before the request is completed or while it's going on. When someone clicks the submit button, there may be a pause, like as the submission is happening. So we want to give them some visual feedback that something is going on. And we can do that using the before key part of this array of options. And what we want to happen is we'll display like some text saying sending, so that they know something is happening. So we can use the JS helper to fade in that text, because we don't want the sending text to just be there when it's not actually sending. We only want it to show up when they click the button, and then we want it to fade out after it's finished. So before the request is completed, we want to use the JS helper, and we're going to use its get method. The get method takes a string, which is an ID of an element that you would like to select. In this case, we want to select an element called sending. We don't actually have this element yet, so let's create it. So I'm going to create a div down here with an ID of sending, and it'll have the text of sending. So this is the element that the user is going to see whenever they click the button as their submission is being processed. Now, as it currently is, it's being displayed all of the time. So we need to use a little bit of styling here to hide it. So I'm going to use some inline styling and set the display property to none. That way it's hidden. So back up here in our submit button, where we're setting what should happen while the request is processing, we're going to use the JS helper to get the element with an ID of sending. That's this message down here. And if you're using PHP 5, you can chain on methods. You can chain on methods using the JS helper. So we're using the get method, and we're getting the element of sending, and then we're going to chain on the effect method to apply an effect to that element. The effect that we're going to apply is called fade in. So when they click the button, while they're waiting for the submission to go on before it's complete, we grab the element with an ID of sending and we fade it in, because it's currently hidden, because we set the display to none. We can also set what happens on success. This means it has completed. We want to fade out the sending message. Because it's done, they no longer need to send it, so we should get rid of it. So we're going to do pretty much the same thing. Use the JS helper, its get method. We're going to grab the sending element. We're going to chain on an effect, and we're going to tell it to fade out. And finally, we can tell it when it's completed whether or not it should update a part of the page, and we can tell it what part of that page it should update. So we can use the update key as part of this array of options, and we can pass in a string which is an ID of an element that we want to update. In this case, I'm going to create an element with an ID of success. So when the submission is successfully completed, it's going to update an element with an ID of success. So I'm going to create that element real quick. Up here at the top of the page, I'll create a div with an ID of success. And it's just going to be blank for now. They won't actually see nothing. It is there. And once the request has completed, once it's successful, whatever is returned is going to be updated and stuck inside of this success div. So we're going to give the user a success message, and it's just going to display there. And that's going to be done via Ajax. So let's go over this one more time. We've changed the submit button to use the JS helper instead. The text that will appear on the submit button is called send. We're passing in an array as a second parameter to the submit button, and it's an array of Ajax options. We're telling it before the request is completed, while the user's waiting, we're giving them some visual feedback. We're selecting the element with an ID of sending, and then we're fading it in. When it is completed, we're selecting that element again, and then we're fading it out, because it's completed and they no longer need to see the message of sending. And after it is completed, we're telling it to update the element on the page with an ID of success. And that element is up here, and when it's updated, it's going to display a success message to the user, letting them know that their submission was complete. So now we need to go to our messages controller, and we need to modify our index action so that it can handle the Ajax request. We are checking whether this data is not empty. That means the form has been submitted. We're checking whether or not the data that was passed from the form can be saved. If it does, we're giving them a flash message and redirecting them. This is what we want to do if it's a regular request, if they don't have any JavaScript enabled, and it'll still work without JavaScript. But we want to check whether or not it's an Ajax request so we can handle the request differently. And to do that, we're going to use the request handler. We're going to check if this request handler, and we're going to use the isAjax method. IsAjax returns true or false, whether or not the request is an Ajax request or not. So if it is, we can handle the Ajax here. And if it's not, that means it's a regular request, so we're going to do it the normal way by giving them a flash message and redirecting. So back up here in the part where it is an Ajax request, we need to handle what should happen after the save is done. We don't want to redirect, we don't want to set a flash message, because those all require a page refresh. Instead, we just want to render a view. and whatever is rendered is going to be sent to our view, and it's going to be put into whatever we tell it to update. So whatever view we say to render here, when the Ajax submission is complete, whatever's in that view is going to be stuck inside of this div with the ID of success. So here in the true part of this if condition, if it is an Ajax request, we're going to use the controller's render method, and we can tell it to render a view. In this case, we're going to render a view called success. I haven't created that, but I will in a moment. We're also going to pass in a second parameter to the render method, and this is telling it which layout this view file should use. If by default, if you leave it as you don't pass in a second parameter, it's going to use our default HTML layout here. That means when it renders that view file, it's going to have all of this HTML around it as well, and we don't want that. We want it to use whatever's on the current page. It'd be like there's double amounts of HTML rendered. So what we can do is pass in a second parameter telling it to use a different layout. We can tell it to use the Ajax layout, and the Ajax layout is already built for you. We can take a look at it real quick. Down here in your Cake folder again, under libs, view, layouts, and you see you have ajax.ctp. This is the Ajax layout, and as you can see, there's no HTML. All it's doing is echoing out the content for layout. That means it's just going to use only what's in your view file, and that's exactly what we want here. So I'm going to close it, and I'm going to close the Cake folder again. Alright, so we checked when the form, if the form has been submitted, and if it's successfully saved, we check whether or not it was an Ajax request. If it was, we render our success view file using the Ajax layout, and that will be stuck inside of the div with the ID of success. That'll be updated whenever the Ajax request was successful. If it was not an Ajax request, it's going to do it just like a normal form submission. It's going to set a flash message and then redirect the user. So it'll work even without JavaScript. So what do we need to do now? We need to create this success view so that it has the view file to render. So under app, under views, inside of your messages folder, that's where your index.ctp view is, we'll create a new file and call it success.ctp, and I'll create a p tag here, and I'll say message sent. Let's also give it a little styling so we can see it a little better when it pops up. I'm just going to set the background color to be light green, and then I'm going to go back into my index.ctp file, and where I'm fading in and fading out this div, which is our sending div, giving the user visual feedback that the Ajax submission is happening, inside of the style attribute, I'm going to also set its background color to be light green as well, so that it's easier to see on the page. So I think we're ready to try this out. Let's give it a go. Go back to our browser, and let's refresh the page. And let's look at the source code. So we scroll over, and there's our jQuery file. And then you're going to see this other JavaScript file that's random here. This is what the JavaScript helper generated for us. It cached the JavaScript that was generated from that JS submit helper method, and it stuck it inside of this file. And here you can see the code that the JS helper created. This is jQuery JavaScript code that it created for us, and we didn't have to write any of that. We pretty much just wrote one line and set some options. So let's try it out. Let's enter in a name here and my message, and let's hit submit or send. So what you should see is the page will not refresh. We should get our sending message. It should fade in and then fade out once it's complete, and then we should get a message sent up here. And remember, this will happen via Ajax and the page won't refresh. So let's try it out and hit send. Message sent. And if we take a look at Firebug, we can see in the console that we did a post and it was 200 OK. That means it was successful. We can try it again. Joe2, my message again here. And if you watch Firebug, you'll see that another post will happen in there. There we go. It happened again. And the message was sent. So let's take a look in the database and see if it actually saved it. There we go. We can see Joe2, Joe, and there's our messages that we sent. And those were all done via Ajax. And so that's the basics of using the JS helper. There's a lot of other methods that you can take a look at, but we're going to move on, and we're going to write our own jQuery to do some Ajax form validation, because currently the validation will not happen. It'll only happen, it won't work correct is what I'm trying to say. So we're going to implement it to where if they don't have a name here and they tab out, underneath the name it's going to do an Ajax request in the background, check whether or not the value of this field validates, and if it doesn't, it'll display the error. Same with the email field. If they enter an incorrect email address, when they tab out and move to the next field, it's going to do an Ajax request and check whether or not the email field is valid, and if it's not, it'll display the error message and they can go back and fix it. This way they have a really seamless experience with the application, and they can get the error messages before actually hitting the send button. So let's get started on that. Let's go back to our text editor. We can close a couple of these out. We don't need the layout file anymore. We don't need our success view anymore. And we don't need our model anymore. So we'll keep the controller and the index view open. And what we need to do is create a new JavaScript file. First, we're going to make sure we load it in so we don't forget to load it in. So at the top of this page, remember this JavaScript file is only needed on the index view. So we can load it in right here, and we'll pass in false just like we did before, and that'll make sure that it's stuck inside of a script tag at the top in the head section of our HTML. So I just duplicated that, and I'm going to create a JavaScript file called validation. I haven't made that yet, but I will in a moment. But we're loading in a script tag or a script called validation. Save it, and let's create that under app, webroot, under JavaScript. I'll create a new file called validation.js. And in here we're going to write jQuery to do an Ajax validation request here. We're not actually going to be submitting to the database. We're only going to be passing the field name and the value of the form field to the controller. The controller is going to check whether or not those values are correct or valid. If they are, nothing will happen because that means it's valid, so there shouldn't be anything. The user can just submit the form. If there are errors, it's going to send errors back to the validation script. We'll have a callback function that's going to handle those errors, and we'll display the error on the page, and that'll all happen with Ajax and jQuery. It's pretty simple. There's quite a bit of code here though, so I hope you are familiar with jQuery. Let's get started. We're going to use the standard document.ready and open up our function here. So first we need to grab the form element that we want to check. So we have 3 form elements. We have name, email, and message, and they each have an ID of the same name. So let's just do the name field first. We'll get that one working, and then we'll apply the same code for the email and message afterwards for those fields. So we can grab or select the form field with an ID of name, and we're going to use the blur function or blur method, the event, to check whether whenever a blur event happens on the element with an ID of name. Close that. And so whenever a blur event happens, just in case you don't know what a blur event is, a blur event is when you have the name field selected right now. When I hit tab and I move to the email field, that's a blur. That means a blur event occurred on the name form field. The same can happen when I click away from it. That's also a blur. So whenever that happens, this code is going to be run inside of the blur callback function. So whenever a blur event happens on the field with an ID of name, we're going to do an Ajax request. We're going to do that using the post method. Break that onto a new line. Oops. The post method takes a couple different parameters. The first one is the location that it should post to. In this case, it's our cake contact Ajax, and to the messages controller, and I'm going to call it validate form. So I'll be creating this action validate form, and that's what we're going to submit to, and it's going to do the Ajax validation for us. The second parameter is an object of values that you want to send. We're going to be sending two values to our validate form action. The first value is going to be the field name, and the second value is going to be the actual value of the form field that we want to validate to see if it's a valid value to actually stick into the database. So we're going to create field. That's going to be the field name. The reason we need to pass in the field name is so that it's dynamic. In our controller, when we create this validates form action, we don't know whether or not the data that was passed in when the blur happens is coming from the name field, or if it's for the title field or the email field, or there isn't a title field, if it's for the email field or the message field. By passing in what the field name is, we know which one to check. And how we get the field name is because we set the ID of that form field. The ID is the same name as the field name. So the ID of our name field is name, and this matches the field in the database for name, and so we can check whether or not the name field in our model is validating appropriately. So we're going to pass in the ID of the name form field, so we need to grab the name field, and we can use the attribute method to grab the ID attribute of the field with an ID of name. So that means it's going to get the ID of our name input field. The ID is name currently. We also need to pass in the value of the form field so that we can check whether or not that value is valid. We can get the value using, we select the name form element again, and we just use the val method of jQuery, and that'll return the value of whatever was entered into the name form field. So that's it for the second parameter. The third parameter, and the final one that we'll be using here, is a callback method or callback function. This function will be called whenever the post for the Ajax request has completed. So I'm going to call mine handle name validation and save it. Now we just need to write this handle name validation callback function. So still inside of the document.ready, but outside of the blur callback function, I'm going to create a function called handle name validation. Now when you create a callback function using jQuery's post method to do an Ajax request, whatever comes back from that request will be passed in as a parameter to the callback. And in our case, it's going to submit to validate form in our messages controller. I don't have the validate form action created yet, but once I do, if there's an error, it's going to send that error back, and that's going to be available in our callback, and that's going to be passed in as the first parameter. So I'm going to call that error. So now we have this error variable that we can use in here to check whether or not, when we did our Ajax request, whether or not we have an error. So we can first say if error.length is greater than 0. If the error.length is greater than 0, that means we obviously have an error. Now, since we have an error, that means we need to create an HTML element to display that error on the page so that the user can see that there's been an error. We're going to give that HTML element a unique ID. That way we can reference it and check whether or not it's currently displaying, and so we can also hide it, because if there are no errors, like the first time they go to it, if they tab out, it's going to display the error. But if they go back and they enter in valid information and they tab out, we need to make sure that we then hide the error. We don't want it to display. So we're going to be giving it a unique ID. So first we're going to check. We're going to select an element. In this case it's going to be for our name form field. So we're going to check for name not empty. And this I am naming myself. This is what the ID of that form element, which is going to contain our error message, is going to be. This is what the ID will be of that element. So I'm checking whether or not its length is equal to 0. If its length is equal to 0, that means it's not there, so we need to display it. So we're going to create that element. We're going to create a div here. And we're going to close the div. And what's going to be inside of the div is going to be whatever the error was that was returned. So if we have an error, we're going to create a div tag. There's the opening tag and there's the closing tag, and the contents of that div tag contains whatever error was passed back to the callback function of our post request up here. So we need to give this div the unique ID that I told you about. The unique ID is what we're checking for the length of up here. If it's equal to 0, we don't have it, so we're going to display it first. So we're going to give ID equals name hyphen not empty, meaning the ID of this div is just, it's for the name field, and we're saying that it's supposed to be not empty. So this will display the div tag properly, but we need to put it in the correct position. We don't want it to just be anywhere. We want to insert it after that form field. So we have this form field of name has an ID of name. If they tab out without entering anything and it's invalid, we want the div to show up underneath here. Correct? So we can see it, that it's part of the name form field. So we need to tell it to insert after that form field. That's really easy using jQuery. We can just select the name form field again, and we'll use the after method to tell it to insert it after the name form field. I'm also going to give this div, which displays our error, a class. This class is going to be called error message, and the Cakephp default layout and its style sheet has styling already for a class called error message, and that'll style our error message to make it look pretty for us. That's all it's there for, is for styling. So we can save it. So this is going to handle if we have an error, and if we don't have an error, we need to make sure that if this is if the div showing the error message is there, that we remove it, because if there's no error, we don't want to tell them that there is an error. So we can just remove it. That's why we gave this div container an ID, a unique ID, so that we can check or reselect it and then remove it. So we're selecting the error div, and then we're just going to remove it. So if we have an error, we display the error message after the form field. If we don't have an error, we make sure that we remove it just in case it's there so it's not being displayed again. So we can save this. And now we can write our validate form action in our controller, because that's where this post is going to post to. So in our messages controller, I'm going to create a new public method called validate form. And this is actually pretty simple. We're just going to check if this, we're going to use the request handler again. We're going to check if the request is an Ajax request. If it is an Ajax request, what we need to do is populate the this data array. Remember that this data array is the array that you can check when a form's been submitted. Like up here, when the form's been submitted, all of its values are in this data, and it's properly formatted to be submitted to the model to be saved. We're not actually doing a save here. We're just checking whether or not the form field is valid. We just want to do the check, and if it's not valid, we want to send them an error and display that, and we're doing that via Ajax. So what we want to do is pre-populate this data with whatever was sent or posted back from our jQuery Ajax call. Remember, we're going to post the field name and we're going to post the value of that field. Now we can access these values, whatever field we passed in and whatever value we passed in, using the controller's params, or yes, the params array. So we can access the value of field and we can access the value of value using the params array. And we can pull those respected values from whatever was posted. So what we need to do is populate the message data array, and we could hard code in here that we want to populate the name or the email, but that won't work because we don't know whether we're checking the name, email, or the message. This needs to be dynamically inserted. This is why we passed in the field name. This will be dynamic to whichever field is being validated. Field is going to be equal to whichever field we're trying to validate. So if we tab out of the name field, the Ajax request is going to send in the field name of name. If we tab out of the email field, the field name is going to be sent in as email. And that's going to be available to us through these field and value parts of the param hash or param array. So we want to pre-populate this data array, and it's part of the message, because remember, this data, the first part of the key of the array is the model and the second is the field name. So here we're going to use the params array, and we're going to access the form, and then we're going to grab the value of the field. This field matches this field that we posted back. So we're just going to populate that, and we're going to make its value be equal to the value of the params that was passed. This value is the same as this value here. We're grabbing these values that we posted back. Value holds the value of the current form field that we're validating, and field holds the field name of the field that we're validating. So we're taking the value of that field and we're populating it into the this data array so that we can check whether or not it's valid. To check whether or not it's valid, we can use the model's set method to send the data to the model to be validated. All we're doing is calling the model's set method, and we pass in the this data array. Remember, we just populated the this data array with the value of the form field that we want to check is valid. Next, we need to check if it is actually valid. When you send data to the model, we now have a new method that we can check. We can say this message validates, and we can use that in a conditional like I'm doing here. I'm saying if this message validates, this is going to return true or false if whatever we pass to the model validates or not. If it does validate, that means there was no errors. We don't want to do anything. We don't want to display anything, we just want to leave it alone. And to do that, we need to tell it to set auto render equal to false. That way it doesn't render a view. Because if you don't put anything in there, by default, Cake Actions will render the view. It's going to try and render the validate form view. And that's not what we want. If the message validates, that means there were no errors, so we don't want to render anything. We just want to leave it alone. But else, meaning that the message did not validate, we need to send the errors to them so we can display those errors and let them know that they need to correct the form before submitting it. So I'm going to create a variable here called error, and we can grab the current errors by using this what's it called, validate errors method, and then just pass in the actual message. And this is going to pull all of the validation errors for the message model, and it's going to store it as an array inside of this error variable, but it's going to be an array. So we can now send this error to the view so that we can display the error. We can do that by using the set method, of course, and make it available in the view as a variable called errors, or error in this case. And then the second parameter is the actual data that we want to send to the view. What we want to send is our error array up here, but we only want to send the error for the current field. Because remember, we're populating this data with the field that's being passed in from our post. So if they tab out of the name field, it's going to be, field is going to be name. And we only want the error for that current field. We don't want the error for any of the other fields. So we can tell it to only include the error for that field. And we access that through the key. The key is going to be that field that we're validating. And remember, that's passed in through the validate, through our post request back here. So we can save this. So I know there's a lot going on here and it might be confusing at first, but it's actually pretty simple. We're just doing a post request. We're passing in the field name of the field that we're trying to validate, and we're passing in the value of that field. We can access those values using the params array, and it's inside of the first key is inside of the form key, and then you can access field and value respectively. Since we're not doing a database submission, we're only checking if these values are valid. We have to populate this data manually. So we're populating this data, and the first key is the message because we're dealing with the message model, and the second key is the field name, and this is dynamic, so we're using the params field value that we passed in, and we're giving it a value of whatever value was passed in from our post request. We're then setting this data to the model so we can check if it validates. If it does validate, meaning there's no errors, we make sure that it doesn't render anything. We want to make sure that it just doesn't do anything. There's nothing wrong with the form, they can just continue. But otherwise they do have errors, so we grab the validation errors for the message model, and then we pass in only the error for the field that's being validated, and it's available inside of our view as error. So now we need to create this validate form view. So if we go to views, messages, create a new file, call it validate form.ctp. Is that correct? Yes. And then in here, all we need to do is display the error. So we can just echo out error. Remember, this error is coming from where we're setting it. We're setting the error here, and it's going to display the error for the current field. The validate form error, the validate form view whatever is displayed in that view is going to be stuck inside of this div that we created in our handle name validation function or callback. So it's all together. We should be able to try this out. It's all together at least for the name field. We haven't duplicated any of this code for the email and message fields yet, but it should work for the name field. Maybe we have some errors. Let's try it out. We'll go to the browser and we'll refresh this page. No errors yet. Let's look at the source code and make sure that our validation script is being loaded in. There it is. Alright, let's try it out. So if we don't enter anything in here and we tab out, on the blur event it should do an Ajax request and check whether or not the current value is valid. We tab out and you can see it now says enter your name. It's not valid. If we go back to it and tab again, it's displaying it again. So it looks like we do have an error. Let's figure out what I did wrong here. Let's go back to my validation.js file. Yeah, here's my error. You can see I accidentally wrapped when we created the new div here, you can see I wrapped it in an extra jQuery object here. We don't need that. So we can remove this and the closing one there and save it. So it should be we select the element or the form field with the ID of name, and then after it we're creating the div here to display the error message. That was the problem. So we can save it, go back to the browser, and let's try refreshing. So if we tab out, we get enter your name. If we tab out again, it's still not working. So looks like I made another mistake. It's pretty easy to make these typos. As you can see in the actual ID declaration, I'm including a hash symbol. You don't need to do that there. You only need to do that when you're trying to access it through jQuery. Here I'm actually setting the ID of the element, and you don't want to put the hash symbol in there with it. So hopefully that's the last error. That was 2 errors in a row, huh? Alright, let's try it again. We're selecting the correct elements here. I hope it works. Let's save it and go back to our browser, and I'll refresh, and let's tab out and our error shows up. If we tab again, there we go, we still only have 1 error, and that's how it should work. It shouldn't give us multiple errors in a row. So it did the Ajax request, it checked if a blank name value is correct, and of course it's not. It's saying enter your name. So we enter our name here and tab out. Our error now disappears because it's now valid and it doesn't need to display the error. So it looks like it's working. Let's try it again. And we can see the Ajax submissions happening down here in Firebug. Let's clear all of this real quick. And so if I tab out, you can see it does the post request. And then if I enter in a name, it does another post request. So let's now apply this to both the email and the message fields as well. So we need to go back to our text editor, and in validation.js we're just going to duplicate the blur and the callback function. Now of course you could refactor this out so you don't have duplicated code, but just to make this easy for people who are not quite familiar with jQuery and Cakephp, by doing it this way it's more linear and easier to understand for the tutorial. So I'll paste it down here, and we want to change this to be for the email field, and for the email field, so we're going to just change all of this over so that it's for the email field. And of course we need to rename our callback function here. So I'm going to say handle email, and then we'll rename it here, handle email, and we need to give the div its own unique ID. So it's going to be email and let's say valid, and so we need to duplicate that up here, email valid, and we need to make sure we're checking inserting after the email field, not the name field. And then again down here we want to remove email valid. And let's see if that works. We can refresh. And if we go to the email field and we tab out, it says enter a valid email address. So we'll enter in some gibberish and see if that works. And as you can see, it still says enter a valid email address. And so if we enter in my email, the validation goes away, and we'll check the name again. Please enter your name, please enter your email. And lastly, let's do that for the message field. So let's change all of this to message. And the callback should be handle message validation. And message. And so we need to change this ID to be message and not empty. And down here, the ID should be message, not empty, and message, not empty. There we go. So save it, and we should try all three out now. Name, email, and message. And so if we enter a name, a wrong email, and our message, the name and message fields validate. Let's close out Firebug, we can see that it's working. But the email is still wrong, so we'll try Joe. I'll select that, and it validates. So now we can hit send. Sending, message sent. So it was Andrew, Joe Gmail, and then this gibberish message. Let's see if it's in our database. There it is, Andrew, Joe at Gmail, and our message. So that's a look at using jQuery with Cakephp and using Cake's built-in JS helper to do Ajax submissions and Ajax validation. I hope you found this helpful. It is a little confusing. As you can see, those errors that I made are very easy to make. So while you're following along, make sure you type very carefully, because you mess up one of the IDs or anything like that and your application will break. So let me know what you think about it in the comments, and thank you for watching.